Well, if you're watching this video, that means you're probably in the fantasy football playoffs. So congrats, kudos to you. Now, all we have to do is win the next 3 games and get that fantasy football championship. We're going to help you do that. Starting with this video, we are talking about 10 players that I think you need to be starting in week 15 of fantasy football. As always, we're going to be breaking them up into your smash starts, your solid starts, and your high risk, high reward starts. And I want to say again, I really do appreciate each and every one of you guys this year. It's been so fun. It's sad that it's coming to an end, but if you do end up enjoying the video, I would really appreciate if you consider leaving a like, subscribe to the channel, comment down below, and I will be starting a Dynasty channel this offseason, so be on the lookout for that. But let's start with the high risk, high reward category. First guy up is Devin Neal, who I think is really starting to heat up for the Saints. He's coming off his best game of the season. He scored his first NFL touchdown in week 14, and he's racked up 60+ total yards in 3 straight games. I'm assuming that Neal is set for another workhorse role, considering Alvin Kamara probably doesn't play in this one. He's most likely done for the season, but we will have to see if Alvin does push to play again this year. But I think you can assume that Neal will be the guy in week 15, and the rookie has seen 71% or more of the snaps over his last 3 games. And the matchup is great. I think he's going to shred this very beatable Panthers defense that's allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to running backs since week 7. And yes, there is some risk here as the Saints offense is very inconsistent. They look great at times. They look horrible at times. I still do think you can feel very confident starting Neal this week. It's a great matchup. He should be the guy in this backfield. I think he's a really good back. He looked great last week, so he's a guy who seems like a lock for 12+ fantasy points in week 15. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jayden Reed, who finally returned in week 14 after missing the last 10 games with that broken collarbone. He had a Jones fracture in his foot, but he stepped right back into a very nice role, a very valuable role for the Packers. He saw 65% of the routes, 24% target per route run rate, 17% target share. And I think Jayden's role is only going to continue to grow as he kind of gets eased back into this offense. It's not a great matchup on Sunday against the Denver Broncos, but I think if you want to place a bet on any Packers pass catcher, I would pick Reed, because Christian Watson, who primarily plays on the outside, might get shadowed by Pat Surtain, which would not be great for him. I think that Reed can kind of hide in the slot and eat in the slot. He could be a PPR machine this week, even in a tough matchup. I think he could quietly have a very nice game. So if you have Reed, he is very flex worthy in week 15. All right, moving on to our next guy, Woody Marks, who hasn't been the most efficient back as of late, but at this point, he is seeing the lion's share of the work in this Texans backfield. He had 28 touches in week 14 and has seen 16+ opportunities in 5 straight games. Nick Chubb also got banged up against the Chiefs, dealing with a rib injury. Even if Nick does end up playing, Marks is just clearly the guy in this backfield. At this point, the Texans clearly trust him in big situations, and the matchup this week is just a lot easier against the Cardinals, as they are allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season, and we all know they just got shredded by Kyren Williams and Blake Corum last week, who combined for 212 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. I would be starting Marks and expect a big-time performance. All right, let's move on to the next category, solid starts. First guy up is Kyle Pitts. Who would have thought? Pitts is actually playing really good football right now, believe it or not. He's a tight end 5 in fantasy points per game over the last 3 weeks. And let's face it, he's the #1 guy in this Falcons passing attack with Drake London out. London's going to miss again this week, tonight on Thursday Night Football. But Kyle has seen 18 targets and 172 receiving yards over his last 2 weeks. And he balled out in week 14, 6 receptions, 90 yards on 10 targets, 15 fantasy points, 94% route participation, 33% target share, 30% target per route run, 34% first read share over his last 3 games, which is actually higher than Trey McBride. That is pretty crazy. I know it doesn't feel comfortable to invest in Kyle Pitts because he could burn you any given week, but I think he's going to eat again against a pretty bad Tampa Bay Bucks defense that's allowing the 6th most passing yards per game, along with the 5th most fantasy points, 3rd most yards and receptions to tight ends since week 12. I think Pitts has a massive game tonight, finds the end zone for only the 2nd time this season. start him with confidence. It is obviously worth noting that Pitts is coming into this game questionable. By the time you're watching this, maybe we already know that Kyle is going to suit up. I would assume that he plays, but definitely monitor that. All right, moving on to our next guy, RJ Harvey, who's on an absolute heater right now. And I don't think he's going to be slowing down anytime soon. Back-to-back games of 20-plus fantasy points, 3 touchdowns over his last 2 games. RJ is the Broncos' workhorse back at this point. He had 23 opportunities last week against the Raiders, and they're using him on the ground and through the air. And he's earned 10 targets since the Broncos came out of their bye in Week 13, along with 100% of the snaps inside the 5-yard line over the last 2 games. So they're using Harvey on the ground, through the air, in pass down situations, in the red zone, near the goal line. Like, he has such a valuable role on this offense, and he's finally starting to pay off for all those people who spent pretty high draft capital on him this summer. And yeah, it is a tougher matchup against the Packers, but since week 6, Green Bay has allowed the 6th most rushing yards. So this is a defense that has taken a step back a little bit as a whole in terms of stopping the run, but I just don't think there's any world where you bench Harvey in the first round of the playoffs with how well he's playing at this point. I'm the type of guy who always recommends to start your studs. So yeah, put Harvey in your starting lineup, feel good about it. I do think that he overcomes a relatively difficult matchup, but like we just said, Green Bay has been beatable on the ground as of late. All right, moving on to our next guy, Justin Jefferson. I apologize. I was screaming from the rooftop last week to make sure you started him, and he burned us yet again. He continued to stay ice cold, but I also didn't think the Vikings were going to blow out the Commanders in a game with Jaden Daniels under center. Like, I didn't have that on my bingo card. Yeah, Daniels did end up getting hurt, didn't return, but I do think you have to go back to the well with the ultra-talented receiver unless you somehow have a better option. But here's why I think Jefferson is startable this week. J.J. McCarthy had his best game of his career in week 14. He was 16 of 23, 163 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Yeah, it was against the Commanders, who do not have a good defense. But if anything, it was a huge confidence boost for McCarthy, who just needs to be average. If he can just be an average quarterback the rest of the way and just force feed the football to Jefferson, I think that he can eat. I think it's going to happen. One of these big Jefferson games are coming. We don't know when they're going to come, but if it was going to happen, it's going to happen this week on Sunday Night Football against the Cowboys, because their secondary is horrendous, as they are allowing the most fantasy points per game, yards, and touchdowns to receivers this season. And you got to think the Vikings are going to be chasing points against an elite Dallas offense. It'll be interesting to see if CeeDee Lamb plays in this one, but we've seen George Pickens fill that role regardless very well. I just think everything is lining up for Jefferson to have his first double-digit fantasy performance since week 11. And again, I'm always the type of guy who would rather go down with my studs in my starting lineup than have Jefferson on your bench and he goes off and you lose your matchup and you regret it forever, right? So start Jefferson, ride the wave. If you drafted Jefferson, I'll be surprised if you're in the fantasy playoffs, right? Maybe you ended up trading for him, or let me know in the comment section. I'm actually pretty curious about that, but I'm starting Jefferson anywhere I have him this week, even though it is scary. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jackson Dart, who had his worst game of his rookie season in week 13, right before the Giants bye. He only had 13.6 fantasy points, but that's not terrible. That tells you how great Dart has been, how impressive he's been from a fantasy perspective and a real life perspective this year. His ability on the ground has given him a great floor in fantasy, as he scored at least 1 rushing touchdown in every game from week 6 to 10. That's crazy. He's averaging 21.7 fantasy points per game as a starter. And we just talked about this Commanders defense. He should have no problem crushing this Washington defense that just gave up 3 passing touchdowns to J.J. McCarthy last week. This Washington defense is also top 5 in passing yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points per game allowed to quarterbacks this season. So yeah, Dart is one of the more obvious strong starts at the quarterback position this week. I think he absolutely goes off. All right, let's move on to the smash starts section of the video. You could very well put Jackson Dart in the smash start section if you really wanted to. But first guy up here is Travion Henderson. The Patriots coaching staff, they did exactly what we all feared. In Stevenson's second game back, coming off that foot injury, we kind of suspected that he was eased in the week before, but they're like, nope, Stevenson is our guy. He was the starting back for New England. 60% of the snaps, 48% of the rush attempts, 58% of the routes, but struggled. 3.3 yards per carry compared to Travion, who was averaging 6.1 yards per carry. I don't know what this coaching staff sees in Stevenson at this point. I don't know what kind of loyalty they have, but Travion Henderson is clearly the better back. It's so obvious. Everyone can see it. Open up your eyes, coaching staff of the Patriots. Like, seriously, Travion leads the Patriots in rushing yards, touchdowns, yards per carry, explosive run rate, missed tackles forced, and yards after contact. Hopefully that we know the Patriots are coming off a bye. Hopefully they just really opened up those eyes, watched the tape, saw what everyone else sees, and finally realized that Henderson needs to be the featured back on this offense. And why would just stop playing games? Stop playing games, New England, because week 15 against the Bills is a massive game. And I don't know, play your best players. Like, I think regardless, though, Henderson is going to have a strong bounce back performance, as Buffalo has allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to the position, along with the most rushing touchdowns and 6th most rushing yards. So get Henderson back into your lineup, and I do think he has a big game. All right, moving on to our next guy, Davante Adams, who finally took a back seat to Puka Nacua last week. Adams also failed to find the end zone for the first time since week 6. That is wild, but, you know, Adams still leads the NFL in receiving touchdowns with 14, and surprisingly, he didn't hit pay dirt last week in a game where the Rams put up 45 points on offense, but we'll forgive you, Davante, because you have been a baller this year, and I don't think that the drought is going to continue. The touchdown drought is going to continue longer than a week, as Vegas has this matchup against the Lions as the highest point total on the slate at 55.5. And Detroit has one of the worst secondaries in football, as they are allowing the most fantasy points per game to receivers over the last 5 weeks. And they just lost their stud safety in Brian Branch to a torn Achilles for the year. So even a worse secondary than they already were. So yeah, expect Davante to explode in this one in what could be one of the biggest shootouts of the season. Not much to say here. Don't overthink it. Adams should go crazy. All right, moving on to our next guy, Derrick Henry, who the King has been better as of late for fantasy, even though he kind of let you down last week, only scoring 11 fantasy points against the Steelers, but he was still able to rack up 100 total yards, so you like that. And he scored 17 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. The Ravens need to win football games. They probably need to win out if they want to make the playoffs. And hopefully the Ravens don't make the same mistake that they made in week 13 when they faced off against the Bengals, which was not giving Derrick Henry enough work. He only had 10 carries for 60 yards in that game. The game plan this week needs to be give a heavy dose to the future Hall of Fame running back early in the game. Henry should have no problem running all over this terrible Bengals run defense, as they are allowing the most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. Yeah, the only issue, though, is that if Cincinnati gets up big early, forcing the Ravens to pass. But as long as that doesn't happen, I think Henry could have his best game of the season in week 15. That's all I have for you guys today. I really appreciate each and every one of you. Let's win some fantasy football championships this season. If you did end up enjoying the video, consider leaving a like, comment down below, tell your friends, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.